Welcome back to Philosophy 1101, Problems of Philosophy at the University of Connecticut. This week we will be discussing freedom of will. And as we do so, we want to distinguish between two different notions or dimensions of the idea of freedom. And contemporary terminology often confuses these, so I want to try to separate them, and then we'll try to warn you, flag, when I'm using the term in one way as opposed to another. On the way I want to use the terminology, freedom of action is what we most often mean by freedom of will in everyday parlance. Freedom of action is a matter of performing an action in such a way that you could have done otherwise. Here I am with my index finger, and I feel that I'm free to decide whether or not to wiggle it one way or the other, up or down, backwards or forwards, as the case may be. Intuitively, phenomenologically, it seems like I've got complete control over what my finger does, which action I perform with regard to the wiggling of my finger. Whereas, if we define the will as that set of desires that are, generally speaking, efficacious in producing actions, where, for example, thinking back to Ryle, from a Rylean perspective, one's will is going to be that set of dispositions to action that will result in your acting angrily under certain circumstances, in your clowning cleverly under many circumstances, in your being a good appreciator of certain types of movies or certain types of fiction. You prefer one type of ice cream over another. You dislike a certain kind of sport. All those things taken together, let's define as your will. With that understood, then we can say that freedom of will is a matter of having the will that you choose to have. That is, doing something or other that can result in your modifying the will, or if not, then at least sticking with the will that you choose to have if you already are satisfied with the will that you've got. But in many cases, you might find you want to modify your will in such ways to be less of a procrastinator, more of a patient person, more sensitive to others' needs, more empathetic, etc. Maybe developing interests and likings for tastes in certain activities that for now you might not find very attractive, but maybe because of friends of yours tell you that they're attractive, you think there's a chance that it's worth giving it a try. All those changes that it might be possible to bring about in yourself, I'm going to describe as, if you can make those changes, then those will be exercises of freedom of will. However, the majority of philosophical discussion has been under the topic of freedom of action. Just to warn you about confusion, nevertheless, that is usually referred to as freedom of will, although the more proper terminology should be freedom of action. And just in order to fall in with the step of the majority of discussions here, I'll normally be using the term freedom of will to talk about freedom of action, just to make things a bit more confusing for now, but I think it'll be consistent with literature that we'll find, that we'll be coming across. So just keep in mind, though, that freedom of action, in the way that I'm using the terminology here, and freedom of will are distinct notions. Now, what is the problem with freedom of action? And I'm now going to be switching to calling it freedom of will, although you know that I don't mean the same thing as freedom to have the will that you choose to have. What is the problem with freedom, with free will? What is the free will problem as it's historically been construed? Well, it goes something like this. Let's define universal determinism as the thesis that states that every physical event that occurs in the universe has a prior sufficient physical condition. Universal determinism says every physical event that occurs in the universe has a prior sufficient physical condition. We're not assuming that every event is physical, just those physical events that occur are such that they have a prior sufficient physical condition, where that means that if one were, for example, to be fully aware of the initial conditions of the physical universe, you would be able to infer the next moment of the universe's physical condition. This is an idea that was formulated by the French scientist, sometime philosopher, probability theorist, mathematician, etc., Pierre-Simon Laplace. Here's an image of a stamp that you can find in contemporary France that could be used to mail a letter. Laplace's dates were 1749 to 1827. He was instrumental in developing what's now known as the Bayesian interpretation of probability. He was in fact called during his lifetime, the French Newton, rival with Isaac Newton for his prominence. He's one of the first scientists to posit the existence of black holes, just as we were impressed to learn, I think, that Kant was the first thinker, at least in the Western tradition, to posit the existence, hypothesize the existence of other galaxies. Laplace thought there might be black holes that could be used to explain various otherwise puzzling phenomena. And Laplace is one of only 72 people who have their name engraved on the Eiffel Tower. You can find the list of the remaining 71 prominent French citizens from times past, some of whose names you'll recognize, but Laplace is on that list as well. And Laplace said, he writes, "We ought to consider the present state of the universe as the effect of its previous state and as the cause of that which is to follow. An intelligence that, at a given instant, could comprehend all the forces by which nature is animated and the respective situation of the beings that make it up, if, moreover, it were vast enough to submit these data to analysis, for such an intelligence nothing would be uncertain, and the future, like the past, would be open to its eyes." This is from his book called A Philosophical Essay on Probabilities. That idea is now referred to as Laplace's demon. Think of Laplace's demon as follows. Laplace's demon is sort of a superphysicist with an extremely powerful computer at its side. And the idea of Laplace's demon is that if that demon, who's not necessarily malicious or malevolent, if that demon were able to determine the entire state of the physical universe at a given moment, then with enough calculation, with the computer, maybe a very large pad of paper, enough patience, then Laplace's demon would be able to calculate the entire physical state of the universe at a later moment, be it 1 second, or given that he's postulated he'd be able to calculate what happens a second from now, maybe 5 seconds later, and then on that basis, another 5 seconds beyond that, and on that basis another 10 seconds, and so on, churning forward as far into the future as he wishes to do. That is to say, Laplace's demon can predict all the later states of the universe, of the physical universe that is, on the basis of any earlier state, no matter how far forward or back in time. Notice that Laplace's demon only uses physics. We're not supposing for a moment that Laplace's demon has any supernatural powers. We're not defining Laplace's demon as having anything like omniscience. He's just got a very large but still finite mind, a very large but still finite computer, and is able to calculate this future state of the universe based on the current state of the universe. Now, that's a very powerful idea. Think of it intuitively in smaller terms. Think about on the more or less two-dimensional case of a billiards table. And if you've played pool, you know that if you know the current state of all the balls on the table and then can determine how one of the balls is hit, the amount of momentum, the angle at which it's hit, if you know enough about what the surface is like, the resistance on the part of the bumpers on the side, you should be able to calculate where all the balls will end up after all the energy is dissipated. And in fact, there are computer programs that approximate that pretty well. If you want to play billiards on your laptop or smartphone, it's not that hard to find an app that will allow you to do that. And what the machine does is calculate in a sort of quasi-physical way the future state of the system based on the current state of the system, assuming that it's a closed system. Now, take that idea and generalize it not just to 2 dimensions, but to 3 dimensions. Suppose you've got a 3-dimensional billiards table so that the balls are floating around in a fluid. Again, so long as you know the physics of the fluid and the way in which the position of all the balls and the way in which one of the balls is hit, even in now 3 dimensions, there should be no difference in principle to the possibility of calculating the end state of all the balls after one of them is hit, and hopefully hitting some of the others, making perhaps a couple of them go into corner or side, ceiling, etc. pockets. Now, if in fact, as seems to be well supported, your body is nothing but, so to speak, a large collection of billiard-type objects, that is atoms, that have various states of excitation, energy, etc., various bonding properties with others, making up molecules, and so on. If that's the case, then there should be no reason in principle why a superphysicist like Laplace's demon couldn't make predictions about the future state of your body based on the current state of your body, at least with regard to all the physical aspects thereof. That is, suppose that this morning Zeke gave over control of the information about you. He hasn't removed your brain from your cranium. Zeke relinquished all the information that he had about you over to Laplace's demon, and Laplace's demon does a lot of physical calculations, thinks hard, makes his calculating machine go very fast, whirs and spins, and now it makes a prediction that, for example, Maria, suppose your name is Maria, will be having a bowl of a certain type of cereal at exactly 8:17 a.m. Now, if that happens, then the predictor has made a prediction of your behavior based on the current physical state of the system that is you. And if we live in a deterministic system, that is, if the thesis of universal determinism is true, then that is to say that Laplace's demon could have predicted precisely what you'd have for breakfast and when, where, in what condition, in what orientation, etc., how much, before you even started eating, and perhaps even, presumably even before you even woke up. So that not only is your action predictable, but that it was the result of physical causes that were there occurring even before your day started. And the same point applies to what would happen if we were to pull time back, think back to what the predictor, Laplace's demon, would have been able to do even before you were born. That is, there are just a finite number of further calculations that would have to be made that could have been made at the day of your birth or the day before your birth, that would determine the physical situation of the mother out of whom you sprang and the way in which your early life went. These are all physical states of affairs. If universal determinism is true, then it looks like the conditions of your body are just an inexorable physical process that was determined by events that obtained even before you were born. So that Laplace's demon, in principle, would be able to predict what you would do, what you'd have for breakfast this morning, even before you were born, say 19 years ago or 20 years ago, depending upon how old you are. And many feel that if everything you do is in this sense predictable based on physical conditions that occurred even before you were born, then one might wonder, is my sense of freedom when I wiggle my finger or eat my cereal for breakfast and so forth, is my sense of freedom illusory? How can I be free if I live in a world that is governed by deterministic laws, that is governed by events that inexorably flow forward based on a deterministic causal process? That is or at least one important formulation of the problem of freedom of will. That is something that has made many thoughtful, reflective people, not just academic philosophers, but many others, wonder whether freedom of will, in the sense that we actually define as freedom of action, whether freedom of will is an illusion or something we can rely upon as a genuine part of our experience. Well, one thing we want to lay down as a sort of baseline for answering the question whether under these conditions I can be said to have free will is the could have done otherwise condition. Many people feel that it's intuitively obvious that one necessary condition for being able to have free will is that when I do something, if I perform an action, I could have done otherwise than do what I did. So here's a partial definition. When I perform an act X, it seems that if that act is free, then it must be the case that I could have done otherwise than I did. So here's a case in which I seem clearly to lose my freedom. Suppose that, unbeknownst to me, I have inside of me a disposition to suffer from a Tourette's kind of syndrome, and I'm walking down the hall in a building where I work, and I happen to be passing someone on my left, but without any warning, what happens is that I have a Tourette experience, and my left elbow goes up, and it whacks the woman I'm passing on the cheek very hard, causing her jaw to be broken. Now, here's a case in which I would certainly apologize and I'd do everything I could in order to fix the damage. If necessary, I would hope that I'd be able to pay for the hospital bill and so on. But I would also feel like I'm not morally responsible because I did not do that damage freely. That is to say, I wasn't free in behaving the way that I did. Why is that? Well, because I would say I couldn't have done otherwise. Even if I had tried to prevent that from happening, at least at the time, I would not have been able to do so. So one benchmark we want to have for what counts as the case of freedom of action, is could I have done otherwise? And in the case of a Tourette's kind of phenomenon, it looks like we would say, no, I couldn't have done otherwise. Contrast that with the situation in which I intentionally and maliciously cause my arm to go whack against this poor innocent person's cheek, causing her jaw to break. Now, that's a situation in which you might feel like I could have done otherwise. But on the other hand, if we live in a purely deterministic world, if all the physical events that occur even with regard to my body are produced by prior deterministic conditions, then even then you might wonder whether I really could have done otherwise. Maybe the difference between the Tourette's and the non-Tourette's type of situations would vanish under closer analysis. Now, many people, when they first encounter, at least over the last century, when they have first encountered the problem of free will as I've formulated it, have pointed out that, well, in fact, universal determinism is not true. Why? Well, in the 20th century, because of the work of people like Niels Bohr and many others, we know that the world is not deterministic. It's more of a quantum, indeterministic kind of thing. That is to say, the field known as quantum mechanics tells us that certain events, such as the decay of a radioactive atom, for example, a uranium atom, uranium-238, is going to decay at a certain point, that such events as the decay of an atom are essentially a matter of chance. If quantum mechanics is right, then there is no deterministic basis for why for example, uranium atom decays at one moment rather than another. We know that its decay is very likely to happen over a certain time period, but it seems to be a deep commitment of quantum mechanics that it's not possible to give a deterministic explanation of why that atom decayed at one moment rather than some other. Instead, all that we can say is that there was a certain probability that it would decay within a certain time period. So you might say universal determinism is not strictly true. Does that solve our problem? Does that allow us in good conscience to cast aside the problem of free will because it looks like, after all, we don't live in a purely deterministic world? Well, philosophers have wondered whether that's enough to provide a solution. Perhaps quantum mechanics does not make us free or allow us to see how we're free if we weren't going to be free in a deterministic world. Think about it this way. How could quantum randomness, quantum indeterminacy, make me free if I wouldn't have been free in a purely Newtonian or deterministic world? The philosopher Richard Taylor once wrote, if we were to imagine ourselves as being subject to quantum indeterminacy in a way that one might suggest is what accounts for our freedom, then we'd have to say we're thereby avoiding picturing ourselves as a puppet. That's right. But now we're substituting for that picture one in which it's even less like a human being, a free human being, for the conception that now emerges is not that of a free person, but that of an erratic and jerking phantom, without any rhyme or reason at all. Richard Taylor's idea seems to be the following. If I think of myself as becoming free by virtue of the fact that quantum indeterminacy governs my behavior, then what would be the case? Perhaps that an event in my central nervous system that results in my wiggling of my finger or my bringing a spoonful of cereal to my mouth is an event that's triggered by a quantum phenomenon, for example, the decay of an atom, which quantum phenomenon could not have been predicted by prior events. All that we could have done was make a probabilistic judgment. But if that quantum phenomenon is one that brings about my wiggling of my finger or my eating the spoonful of cereal, how does that make me any more free? True, the quantum event is not one that could have been predicted sufficiently and completely by prior events, but it looks like, yet again, I'm still subject to causes in the ways that don't allow me to be the agent or author of my actions. So even if we live in a deterministic world, in an indeterministic world, it doesn't look like that's going to save us from the problem of freedom. Another way intuitively of putting this is, if you, for example, inhabited a deterministic planet, and then somehow miraculously were to move from that planet to a planet that was governed by quantum indeterminacy, in which at least not all events were deterministically predictable, it's not clear how moving from one planet to another would make you free if you weren't free on the deterministic planet, while moving to the indeterministic planet just by itself provide you with freedom. It looks like, if anything, it would just provide you with a certain amount of randomness in your behavior, but why should randomness be the same thing as freedom? That is to say, what I want to conclude from this discussion is, for now, perhaps we should set aside the issue of quantum indeterminacy and take a harder look at what would follow if we were in a purely deterministic world, and keep as a side background thought that it's not clear that acknowledging that we live in a not quite deterministic world is enough to solve the problem. So let's keep on forging ahead. Now, it's often assumed, sometimes uncritically, sometimes unreflectively, that freedom of will and universal determinism are, in fact, incompatible. This is not an assumption that should go without saying. There are reasons for denying that incompatibility. We'll come back to that in a moment. But let's assume that freedom of will and universal determinism are incompatible. Then you have a choice. Either we might infer that freedom of will is an illusion, that is to say that universal determinism, being incompatible with freedom of will, as it were, pushes freedom of will out of the picture. Or you might go the other way and say, no, universal determinism turns out to lose in this battle. Freedom of will is something that we're perhaps sure exists, and therefore so much the worse for universal determinism. Those events that are not deterministic are now of two types, apparently. One, quantum events, such as the decay of a uranium-238 atom. Two, the free actions of a perhaps human being. Perhaps there are other free actions that are performed by non-human animals as well. So the incompatibility of freedom of will and universal determinism doesn't yet tell you which one has to go. It might be that freedom has to go in the face of universal determinism, or it might be that universal determinism has to go in the face of freedom. So let's think about strategy number one, that universal determinism trumps freedom of will. It might go like this. On this strategy, we're simply under an illusion that we're free agents, that we ever exercise freedom of will. In fact, we have no more free will than a robot or a clam. This is the doctrine of hard determinism. Determinism is a hard bullet to bite, a hard thing to accept, but it's something we have to accept all the same. It is something that allows us to see that freedom of will is just an illusion. We should give it up on this view, and maybe a proponent of this view might say, in a few hundred years, it's just a matter of time. Perhaps in a few hundred years, people will look back on the 21st century and centuries previous to it and say, isn't it quaint and charming, but silly, those people back then who thought that they had freedom of will. That's something that I'm glad we finally faced up to. Freedom of will is an illusion. We live in a purely deterministic world, and that does not allow room for freedom of will. But here's a problem with this hard deterministic strategy. On this hard determinism, if there's therefore, on the basis of universal determinism, no free will, what sense can we make of such concepts as responsibility, choice, blame, or praise? I suggested before in the example of the Tourette's event, that if I don't have freedom of will in harming someone else, it seems also inappropriate for that other person to blame me for having behaved badly, for having been responsible, for having chosen, for having been blameworthy or culpable for the action that I did. I might be, in American law, for example, be held civilly liable for such a thing if I caused harm, but if I'm not free in doing what I did, it's going to be much more of a stretch to argue that I should be criminally liable, because criminal liability tends to try to track moral culpability. It doesn't seem like you should blame me for being a bad, vicious, evil, malevolent person for having hurt somebody if doing so is a result of something that's beyond my control. And if hard determinism is true, freedom exists nowhere. And therefore, it's not clear that there's any room for moral assessment, either of a negative kind, such as blame, or of a positive kind, such as praise. It's not clear that we should say that there should be any case in which somebody gets praise or blame. Now, we might still try to modify the behavior of others in a world in which free will is an illusion. For example, imagine you've got a brand new puppy, and you're doing what you can to make sure the puppy is house trained. You'd like to get the puppy house trained as soon as possible. Now, when the puppy has an accident inside the house, you don't blame it. You don't think of it as malevolent or evil. But what you might do is modify the behavior, perhaps with a gentle whack of a newspaper or a scolding kind of voice. And likewise, if the puppy does well in something you're trying to train it to do, you might give it positive reinforcement. So in a world in which there's no free will, and we might assume that there's perhaps no free will on the part of a puppy, we can still modify the behavior of the agent. So too, an application to human beings, a world in which there's no free will might allow room for modifying behavior, and even, for example, incarceration and other forms of behavior modification might still be acceptable, so long as there's evidence that they can reshape the behavior of individuals in ways that we see fit. But blame and praise look like they won't have very much hold in a world in which there's no free will, because blaming someone seems to presuppose that they did what they did and they did so freely, and that view is going to be incorrect in a hard deterministic world. So the hard determinist is going to have to explain what, if anything, is left of morality if you hold that there's no free will. And likewise, others will want to say to the hard determinist, so too, you have to have a view that flies in the face of a very strong current of common sense. So here's another strategy. We're assuming still that freedom of will and universal determinism are incompatible. But another strategy, as I noted before, would be to say, no, I don't want to assume that universal determinism shows that there's no free will. I think the direction goes the other way. That is to say, freedom of will shows that universal determinism is not quite true. So a mid-century Scottish philosopher, his name was Campbell, argued to the following effect: I can know with introspective certainty that I freely choose some of my actions. That is to say, think of universal determinism as an interesting scientific hypothesis that we can only know a posteriori, never a priori. Whereas Campbell will argue, I can know a priori just by introspection, in the way that Descartes can introspect and determine that he exists. Introspect and determine with certainty how things seem to him to be. He can introspect perhaps and find within him an idea of God. Maybe not all of us can do that, but Descartes at least claimed that he could do such a thing. Campbell thinks that so too you can introspect and find within yourself acting freely. So he wants you to imagine the following kind of case. He's willing to grant that many of the actions that we think are free are perhaps not. Perhaps we're more creatures of habit. Nowadays, psychologists would say more creatures of automaticity than common sense tends to acknowledge. But suppose, Campbell writes, suppose that you're in a situation of difficult moral choice. You've got to make a decision. Suppose that you're deciding whether or not, for example, to accept a job that might be very challenging. It might even put you in morally problematic situations. Or perhaps you're deciding whether or not to tell the truth about something or someone that you know, even though the person asked you to keep a secret and you promised that you would. You still feel under a moral obligation to tell others about that secret because you think some harm might be done as a result of your not doing so. So you think hard. Perhaps you spend all night in a vigil with a candle burning down to the bottom. Perhaps you even hold a skull in your hand to add to the drama. And as dawn flickers over the horizon, you finally, after reflecting on the complex issue as hard as you can, you finally decide that you are going to accept the job or tell the truth about that secret, for example. Whatever it is, think about yourself as coming to finally make a decision after much reflection. Here's what Campbell writes about that kind of case. Here and here alone, he writes, so far as I can see, in the act of deciding whether to put forth or withhold the moral effort required to, for example, resist temptation or rise to duty, here and here alone is to be found an act which is free in the sense required for moral responsibility, an act of which the self is sole author, and of which it is true to say that it could be otherwise, I could have done otherwise. Campbell's idea is the following. When, after hard, careful, strenuous reflection, I finally come to a decision as to what to do in this morally charged situation, there I can introspect and with certainty see myself choosing, see myself acting freely, observe myself engaging in choice, and that's a priori, as opposed to the a posteriori knowledge that we at best have of universal determinism. And as a result, I can know, in a way that trumps any claims of determinism, that I'm acting freely. So Campbell gives a kind of quasi-Cartesian argument in favor of freedom of will, assuming incompatibilism, that is, freedom of will is incompatible with universal determinism. He thinks, therefore, that universal determinism does not apply in those cases of strenuous moral choice. Now, if I could write a letter to Campbell, I might say the following to him by way of possible objection. Dear Campbell, you seem to think that an act of moral choice is an exception to the otherwise universality or near universality, given quantum mechanics, of universal determinism. Is that even credible? Why should we make a special exception of ourselves in the universe? Why is there any reason to think that we're special relative to the rest of the universe, such that here and only here do we have an exception to universal determinism? Oh, and yes, quantum indeterminacy. That seems like it's putting us as a kind of a special category as opposed to all the other types of matter and beings that there are in the wide universe. Whereas Campbell might reply in the following way: Dear Green, your belief in universal determinism is based on the evidence of your and other people's senses. That's a posteriori. How could that evidence possibly undermine my or your, I think you have it too, or your introspective certainty about what happens when we exert moral effort? That is to say, Campbell would suggest, I think in reply to me, that the best knowledge we have, the best confidence we could have about universal determinism will never be as strong as the confidence that we can have about, with introspective certainty, about our own freedom of will. You can introspect and see not just that you exist, but also that you have freedom of will, and that's evidenced by your watching what you do when you decide how to behave in regard to that morally charged situation. So now as we think about the adequacy of these different theories, let's get a sort of diagram. If we ask the question, is freedom of will compatible with universal determinism, we can see answers to it as carving out different possible viewpoints on the nature of freedom of will. On the right we have, no, it's not compatible, and that, as you can imagine, turns into the view known as incompatibilism. Incompatibilism, in turn, takes two different forms. One, the first one we mentioned today, was hard determinism. That is, universal determinism precludes freedom of will. Whereas another route, the route that Campbell espouses, is known as libertarianism, not to be identified with the American political movement known as libertarianism. Libertarianism, in the discussion of the metaphysics of free will, says freedom of will precludes universal determinism. Freedom of will shows, our introspective awareness of freedom of will shows that universal determinism is not true. We already knew it wasn't true in the case of quantum indeterminacy, and furthermore, it's also not true in the case of free human actions. That is what the libertarian will say. But there's another option. Another option is to say that maybe freedom of will is compatible with universal determinism. Maybe the two can go together. And that is a view that was espoused by that pesky philosopher David Hume, who we have mentioned a couple of times before in this semester. Hume asks, do we really have to choose between universal determinism and free will? He's not so sure that we do, writing, I hope to make it appear that all people have ever agreed in the doctrine of necessity and of liberty. That's what in the 18th century was often used to refer to what we now call the problem of free will. According to any reasonable sense which can be put on these terms, and that the whole controversy has hitherto turned merely upon words. That is to say, Hume contends that the so-called free will debate depends upon a misunderstanding of the terminology that we use to describe it, that the notion of free will, if we look at the meaning of the phrase freedom of will and cognate locutions, is being misunderstood when we think that there's an incompatibility with any kind of determinism. So we noticed, by way of developing Hume's view, let's remember that we noticed that free will requires that you could have done otherwise, but Hume will ask, what does it mean to say that you could have done otherwise? His reply will be, well, maybe X could have done otherwise just means, had X chosen to do otherwise, X would have done otherwise. That is to say, the counterfactual claim can be used to spell out the subjunctive claim, X could have done otherwise. Spell that out in counterfactual terms. Had he chosen to do otherwise, he would, or at least would have had a fighting chance of doing otherwise than he in fact did. This is known, and Hume calls it as the conditional analysis of freedom. And the question is now, how does this work to show somehow that universal determinism and freedom of will are compatible? Well, here's the explanation. Suppose that somebody has shot someone else, and we suspect that he pulled the trigger of his own free will. We've got no reason to think that he suffered from a Tourette's or any other kind of episode that made his finger be pulled irrespective of what he wanted to do. So it seems like he pulled the trigger of his own free will. How do we know? Especially if someone challenges us by saying, perhaps his defense attorney challenges us by saying, but look, we live in a deterministic universe. The quantum indeterminacy of the universe may not help to show that he's not free, or that he is. Let's leave that aside. but he did pull the trigger of his own free will. But maybe, his defense attorney says, maybe that's an illusion as shown by the presence of deterministic causes. But Hume might reply, he pulled the trigger of his own free will just means he pulled the trigger and he could have done otherwise. And that, in turn, Hume tells us, means he pulled the trigger and had he chosen to do otherwise, then he would have done otherwise. The idea is that he did pull the trigger, we all know that, and we think that he could have done otherwise. The question is that true in a deterministic world? Hume's answer is, I think it is, so long as we keep clear that we should analyze could have done otherwise in terms of had he chosen to do otherwise, he would have done otherwise. The conditional analysis is what Hume wants to suggest is the best way of understanding the could have done otherwise condition. Now, why does that help? Well, this is a statement, the statement that says X pulled the trigger and had X chosen to do otherwise, then X would have done otherwise. This is a statement that can be true in a deterministic world, that is, a world in which universal determinism is true. So, therefore, can the statement X pulled the trigger of his own free will. Compare. Had the billiard ball been hit differently, it would have gone into a different pocket. Compare that with, had I chosen to do otherwise than I did, I would have done otherwise than I actually did. The first sentence, the billiard ball sentence, seems like it can be true in a deterministic world. Had it been hit differently, it would have gone into a different pocket. That seems perfectly true, even if we're in a deterministic world. And then Hume will argue there's no reason why the same thing can't hold for human actions. Why can't it also be the case that had I chosen to do otherwise than I did, I would have done otherwise, even if I'm in a purely deterministic world? Both propositions, that is, can be true in a wholly deterministic world, and if that's correct, and if Hume's analysis of freedom is correct, then Hume is entitled to say freedom is compatible with universal determinism. Because universal determinism does not rule out the possibility of those counterfactual statements, or conditional statements as Hume will call them, being true. If that's right, then compatibilist has something to teach us about the relationship between free will and determinism. The compatibilist will say, let's not assume that the two have to be in conflict. Perhaps they are consistent with one another, compatible with one another. Now, I stress the importance of Hume's argument for compatibilism, that is, that freedom of will and universal determinism might be compatible with one another, because it seems to me that much contemporary discussion, including that carried out not just by philosophers, but perhaps even more prominently by psychologists, neuroscientists, legal scholars, journalists, and many others, seem to presuppose that if you can find a causal basis for human behavior, you therefore have shown that human behavior could not be free. And therefore, freedom, if we think it exists, will be illusory. For instance, the psychologists Dan Wegner and Talia Wheatley, in an article called Apparent Mental Causation, write in the introduction to their paper, psychological science suggests that all behavior can be ascribed to mechanisms that transcend human agency. The thought behind the remark seems to be, now that we're getting, or perhaps even have, a neuroscientific explanation of the causes of human behavior, that therefore shows that human agency is no longer in the game, no longer a possibility, no longer something we should take seriously. They continue to write, the will is not a psychological force that causes action. Rather, as a perception that results from interpretation, it is a conscious experience that may only map rather weakly, or perhaps not at all, onto the actual causal relationship between the person's cognition and action. Their point seems to be, you of course still experience yourself as exercising your will, but that's not an actual causal process that affects your behavior. Rather, it's just your interpretation of what happens at a more fundamental, physical, biological, neurological level that causes your behavior. The assumption here is that if there's a neural explanation that is deterministic in accounting for your wiggling your finger, you're putting a spoonful of cereal into your mouth, some other physical behavior, then there therefore can't be a question, there's no longer a question of whether or not you're exercising freedom of will. That way of approaching the problem is exactly an example of presupposing incompatibilism, presupposing that freedom of will and universal determinism are incompatible with one another. And our philosophical analysis of these cases suggests that that's a presupposition we should question. That's not a presupposition we should take for granted. So let's think about what it would be like to suppose that freedom of will is compatible with universal determinism, but we should also take account of the fact that neuroscience provides not just a deterministic explanation of human behavior, but an explanation that in some sense might also be thought to, in a more specific way, undermine our experience of freedom. So in some famous experiments by Libet, going back to the 1980s, that have been developed and refined and made more sophisticated in the last couple of decades, Libet and colleagues find that what's known as the brain readiness potential, that is the readiness potential in the brain, that is a spiking of activity across your brain that happens about 550 milliseconds before an actual physical action occurs. That brain readiness potential, or RP, occurs about half a second before the actual action. And if you put subjects in an experimental situation in which they pay very close attention to when they decide to perform an action, they perhaps have a very large clock in front of them, very precise and large clock, and they can track by looking at the clock when exactly it took place that they made the decision to perform an action, such as wiggling their finger. When such studies are done, we find that people report an awareness of their intention to perform an action at about 350 to 400 milliseconds before the action itself, which suggests that conscious intention precedes finger movement, for example, if the case is just the movement of a finger, but it occurs well after the brain events that are signaled by the readiness potential. And as is suggested by more recent research, the readiness potential is the beginning of a cascade of events that result in your performing the action that you do. It's as if the train has already left the station and it's going to cause you to perform an action even before a tenth of a second rather, before you make the decision to perform the action that you do. That is to suggest that your decision is not a part of the causal process. It's more like the steam that comes out of a steam locomotive. It results from a process that has already begun, but it's not something that helps the train go. It's something that is just at most a report on what's happening independent of your decision making. So the Libet experiments have suggested to many that freedom of will is not precluded by determinism just because the brain is a deterministic process. Rather, more specifically, going beyond the Wegner and Wheatley point of view, more specifically we find a deterministic process that begins even before any conscious decision-making occurs. That's one challenge to the reality of freedom of will. Here's another. Brazel-Nito and colleagues had subjects exposed to magnetic stimulation of the motor area of their brains. Each of us has in our brains a motor area that, when activated, produces a cascade of events that results in the movement of our the innervation of our nerves, and then also the movement of our muscles. Now, subjects had the experience of choosing whether to move their right or their left index finger. They had the choice. But what Brazel-Nito and colleagues did was they stimulated the part of the brain, for example, the right hemisphere, which will be instrumental in making movements that happen on the left side of the body, or the left hemisphere that will be instrumental in making movements on the right side of the body. Subjects showed, however, a marked preference for moving the finger that was contralateral to the area that was stimulated magnetically. So if I have my right hemisphere stimulated, then I am much more likely to move my left finger, to wiggle my left finger, and I will experience myself as having chosen to do so, and yet that choice seems to be illusory because it's actually the external scientist who's stimulating my right hemisphere magnetically that seems to be doing the work and making me perform the actions that I do. So the Brazel-Nito experiments seem to be able to show that I can be under the illusion of making a choice to do something with one finger rather than the other, one finger of one hand rather than a finger of the other. I can be under the illusion of thinking that I'm acting freely in a situation of that sort. But if that's right, then both Libet and the Brazel-Nito experiments seem to suggest that maybe introspection is overrated as a source of certainty about my exercises of freedom. That is, both of these studies suggest that my sense of making a genuine choice is at least capable of being fooled In particular, Brasilnito and the Brasilnito study suggests that I can be wrong in thinking that I'm willing which finger to move. I thought that I was deciding to move this one. In fact, it is, so to speak, a decision that was made for me by external sources, by external causes. Now, somebody might say, perhaps Campbell's view is overly optimistic as it concerns our ability to introspect on our exercise of free will. Remember, Campbell had said, I can introspect and be certain that I'm exercising my free will, at least in situations of fraught, complicated moral choice. But perhaps we still have some control over our actions in a deterministic world. Specifically, nothing in the Libet setup or the Brasilnito setup shows that we cannot have done otherwise than wiggle our finger in that experiment. So the idea would be, let's go back to the Libet in particular, leaving aside the Brasilnito for a moment. In Libet, you might say, well, it's one thing to say that the brain readiness potential spikes. One thing to say that the readiness potential spikes at a certain time. But that doesn't mean that I couldn't have done otherwise than doing what I do. Perhaps more investigation needs to be done to determine whether or not my conscious decision to perform an action can, so to speak, shunt the train onto one track as opposed to another, sticking with our railroad metaphor. Might it be the case that my decision to do one thing rather than another, granted there's some energy in motion, but my decision perhaps can make it go in one direction rather than another. If that's the case, then we have to perhaps find a compromise that the readiness potential does some work in causing me to perform some action or other, and perhaps I'm less free than I think I am in choosing to do something. But nevertheless, I'm exercising freedom in choosing what to do. So I'm able to choose what to do, but I'm not able to choose to do something or other. Now, if that's right, then there might still be some room for freedom, but perhaps there's a kind of compromise that has to be forged with determinism, at least on the neurological level, because one might say there's, so to speak, a train that already leaves the station before I make a choice as to what to do. There's something that's going to happen, but my choosing helps me decide which particular action that I'll perform, in which case perhaps freedom of action is to some extent overrated, but that doesn't mean there's nothing left of it at all. Maybe there's some left of it, but less than we intuitively think. Now, if that's right, then we do need to rethink our conception of freedom of action, take into account the results, the things that we've learned from recent studies, particularly among neuroscientists. But at the same time, there might still be room for genuine freedom of action. We just need to refine our thinking of that very notion.